Thank you all for joining us tonight. The first speaker is Bishop Wyn Evans. As I mentioned, he's a former student of Jesus College, Oxford, and before that was Ardwyn Grammar School in Aberystwyth and the University College, Cardiff, where he studied archaeology. His main interest was the way that the history of Wales touched on the prehistoric period, but specifically the period leaving the period when the Romans left and before the advent of the Normans in 1066. So he's former dean of the St David's Cathedral, where we first met, I think, when I worked for the Church in Wales at the beginning of the century, and we had a great deal of fun preparing for the St David's Eisteddfod, and we're very pleased that he then received the invitation to be Bishop of St David's. But certainly during his period as Dean of St David's, his interest developed in the building, the cathedral building itself. So, may I invite you to give a very warm welcome to Bishop Wyn Evans, and we look forward very much to hearing what he has to say about A.G. Edwards and his input into the process of disestablishment, disendowment, and dismantling the Church in Wales. So welcome, Esgob Wyn, and over to you. Thank you, Sean. Well, the First World War broke out in 1914. After Britain, of course, declared war on Germany, there was a rush in England and Wales to enlist. Amongst there were a number of armed forces chaplains, one particularly. He was chaplain to the Denbighshire Yeomanry and was determined to join his regiment in France. No problem, one would imagine, but no. This was no ordinary chaplain. Neither was he an ordinary priest. And in order to explain why, we must remind ourselves that 1914 is characterized not only by the outbreak of the First World War. The 18th of September 1914 saw the successful climax of the campaign to disestablish that part of the Church of England which was in Wales. That is, the Welsh Church Act was passed. It had been a long and a bitter campaign on both sides. And although the church fought long and hard against the assault, the defenders ultimately lost. And by the early 20th century, the campaign had turned into a political as well as a religious one, a part of the process which characterized the sense of national self-confidence and the feeling that Wales as a nation should be treated in a manner relevant to its growing self-awareness, a feeling which had increased during the last half of the 19th century. The question, therefore, was what would happen to Welsh churchmen and the church in Wales in its new form following the passing of the Act, and more importantly, what was going to happen to the leaders of the Anglican Church after passing the Act. Although it wasn't as harsh as some of the bills submitted to Parliament from 1894 on, its terms were difficult enough for the Church. The 4 Welsh dioceses were not only to be disestablished, that is, no longer part of the ecclesiastical organisation dating back to the Restoration in 1660, and therefore reliant on Parliament in Westminster. The 4 dioceses, St Davies, Llandaff, Bangor and St Asaph, were therefore part of one church, the Church of England. The 4 Welsh bishops sat in the House of Lords. Welsh priests were elected to sit in the Congregation of the Church of England. From now on, the bishops wouldn't sit in the House of Lords, neither would the priest be part of the Convocation of the Province of Canterbury. And secondly, of course, from the period much earlier than the Restoration, the 4 dioceses of Wales were part of the ecclesiastical province of Canterbury. And as other diocesan bishops in the south of England, they were suffragans to the Archbishop of Canterbury, in the same way as bishops in north of England were suffragans to the Archbishop of York. So in practical terms, one church existed in England and in Wales. And to separate the two churches, this close relationship would have to be dismantled. Disestablishing the Church of England in Wales would be a political process, would mean dismantling, dismemberment, an ecclesiastical process. And the question arises, what right did a secular parliament have to interfere in church matters? But when we come later on to look in more detail at these actions, we see that there's confusion and ambiguity between the two processes due to uncertainty in understanding the nature of a church. When discussing this aspect of the process, which led to the inception of the disestablished church in Wales. And there was a third element, disendowment, that is, depriving the Church of England in Wales of the properties and funding which maintained its activities. Disendowment of the disestablished church of the income and capital, which would allow it to achieve its mission. And then endowing again by means of the Welsh Church Commission, the county councils of Wales with the income which came from the parish tithe and from other sources for charitable and educational work. And endowing, of course, the University of Wales, also through the Commission's action of transferring to it the property which to date had maintained the bishops and chapters of Wales's cathedrals. At the same time, the commissioners were to transfer the property associated with the Church of England in Wales to a body to which the Act required the disestablished church to set up. That is, to represent her in order to receive the properties allocated to her. And this was to be the commissioners' first duty, which they were to carry out as soon as possible. These were the three things facing the church, which the law of the land had just disestablished on September the 18th, 1914. But since much graver issues than this disestablishment, such as a world war, were facing the world, another act was passed at the same time to prevent the Welsh Church Act from being enacted until after the war. But the prospects for the newly disestablished church were bleak indeed. And it's very likely that those who had fought so diligently to prevent this happening felt disappointed. That is certainly true of A.J. Edwards. And that obviously had happened to him. He wanted to leave Wales and everything involved with it and embark for France with his regiment. He was totally disillusioned. This was a man who'd fought earnestly and fiercely to prevent disestablishment. A man indeed recognized in England and Wales as one of the leading generals on public platforms in Parliament and in print in the battle against any attempt to disestablish the Church of England in Wales. It's no surprise, therefore, that many people, particularly among those who'd fought alongside him, sought to dissuade him from going to France. And as it happened, the 4 Welsh bishops had been invited to the conference of the Welsh Brigade. And the Denbury Yeomanry were part of the brigade in Cardiff. So they took advantage of this fact for the 4 bishops to meet. And they succeeded in convincing him. So he wasn't an ordinary chaplain, but he was a bishop, Bishop of St. Asaph. The man, of course, was Alfred George Edwards, 1848 to 1937. He came from a renowned clerical family, originally from North Cardiganshire, descendants of Joseph Edwards, Hafod y Gofaint, Gwnnws, and then of Hendrefeli yn Ysbyty Ystwyth. Joseph Edwards had been influenced by Daniel Rowland of Llangeitho, and Archdeacon David Evans, writing at the beginning of the 20th century, tells us that since the year 1825, 20 missionaries of peace, in his words, priests, had served the church, 3 sons, 13 grandsons and 4 great-grandsons of Joseph Edwards, and amongst them 1 bishop, 1 dean, and 2 canons. Joseph Edwards' elder son was the Reverend William Edwards, and his youngest son was Alfred George Edwards. Now, William Edwards was educated by John Williams, yr hen Sir, as he was called, at Ystad Meirig Grammar School, and he was ordained straight from school in 1825. By 1834, he'd become rector of Llanymawddwy, and from then, in 1849, when Alfred was only a year old, he moved to Llangollen, where the family was visited by no less than George Borrow, this in 1854. Alfred was educated at home by his father, but he did have a year's education in 1861 at Llandovery College, when his older brother, Henry Thomas Edwards, was a teacher there. And following his death of his father in 1868, he went to his uncle, the Reverend William Joseph Edwards, incumbent of Llandw, Glamorganshire, to prepare for Oxford University. And he entered Jesus College in 1871. He read classics, graduated in 1874, and was appointed immediately back to his old school in Llandovery as second master. And at the age of 27, became principal in 1875. Now, his time at Llandovery is essential in order to understand A.G. Edwards' later contribution. The Welsh Intermediate Institution, or Thomas Phillips Institution as it was called at the beginning, on St. David's Day in 1848. The chief patron was Thomas Phillips, who of course gave a great deal of financial patronage to St. David's College, Lampeter, financially and by contributing to its library, but he'd become disillusioned with the college's attitude towards the Welsh language, particularly when his proposal to endow a chair in Welsh at Lampeter was turned down. So with the assistance of Lady Augusta Hall, Lady Llanover later, and William Rees, the printer of Ton, he established, as can be seen in the Deed of Trusteeship, an educational institution which would bridge that gap between the old grammar schools and the colleges, and which at the same time would provide not only a good liberal education, but more importantly, perhaps, Phillips was anxious to improve the educational qualifications of candidates for the Anglican ministry in Wales. For this, he insisted that the Welsh language be given a prominent place. And Phillips wanted to make provision for Welsh-speaking clerics because the ability to minister in Welsh for services in Wales was essential. The appointment of Archdeacon John Williams, rector of the Edinburgh Academy, the son of yr hen Sir John Williams, and one who was recognised as a prominent educationalist, who's also supported the Welsh language and culture, and he strengthened the vision which Phillips and Lady Llanover and William Rees had for Llandovery. But this was not A.G. Edwards' ideal. His ambition was to tighten discipline at the school, which had become slack under his predecessor, and it must be said that discipline hadn't been all that it should have been under John Williams either. And although Alfred Edwards made an impression on Lady Llanover, who had insisted on interviewing him, by using the word pentrilliad for her butler, and thus persuading her that he was supportive of education in Welsh. His intention was to turn Llandovery into a school which would feed Oxford and Cambridge. He wanted Llandovery to be ranked equal to any public school in the country. And he succeeded. The numbers rose from 27 to 178 at the end of his term as principal, and he added suitable new buildings. What suffered in this process was the place, status and situation of the Welsh language in the school. That's it, Edwards had almost totally ignored the provision for the language enshrined in the deed of trusteeship. After 11 years in a difficult period, he'd lost his first wife in 1884, a period, in his own words, when he was under great strain. Basil Jones, Bishop of St David's, offered him the post of private secretary to the bishop. He moved not to Abergwili but to Carmarthen, because the bishop had appointed him vicar of the parish church of St Peter. Now, I think that the connection between him and Bishop Basil Jones, who had, after all, ordained him in 1874 and appointed him curate of Llandovery, this is helpful, I think, in understanding Edwards' later attitudes. And Cadron Roger Brown has reminded us that Basil Jones commended Edwards to the attention of the Prime Minister, Salisbury, as the next Bishop of St Asaph in 1889. Now, although Basil Jones didn't take a prominent part in the Disestablishment controversy, the first bill in 1894 was presented at Westminster during his time as bishop. Now, Basil Jones wasn't in favour of disestablishment. Indeed, quite to the contrary. He is remembered for his comment that Wales was merely a geographical expression rather than a country or a nation. And this reflects Edwards' attitude towards Wales. It was an integral part of Britain, and her church was one with the Church of England in England. In 1889, Edwards was appointed Bishop of St Asaph to succeed Joshua Hughes, and the prospects were good. He was Welsh, he could speak Welsh, and was an educationalist and a good organiser. And of course, he was returning to the diocese where he'd spent his youth. Immediately he arrived in his diocese, he found himself embroiled in the tithe wars. Now, the agricultural depression of the 70s, the 1870s, meant that paying the tithe, the land tax, was very difficult. And in addition, of course, non-conformist farmers refused to pay the tithe as a matter of principle. They weren't willing to maintain a church they didn't belong to. And the result was sequestration, auctions of sequestered properties, and uprising. Edwards, as a member of the House of Lords, was responsible for the discussions which led to the Tithe Act of 1891, when the responsibility for paying the tithe was transferred from the tenants to the landowners. And about the same time, Edwards began to take his place in the campaign with which he's chiefly associated, namely the battle to defend the Church of England in Wales against any attempt at disestablishment. This came into prominence when the Liberals came to power in 1892. A disestablishment of the Church in Wales and in Scotland was in their manifesto. And a bill was brought forward in 1894, but the government fell in 1895. This is significant when we consider Edwards' attitudes and character and his contribution to the triple campaign to disestablish, disendow and dismember the Church of England in Wales. It's therefore worth spending a few minutes in examining two events, two disputes which arose, and both of which throw a light on the attitudes and character of A.G. Edwards, and both relevant to his diocese and its supervision of it. Soon after he became bishop, A.G. entered into a dispute with David Howell, vicar of Wrexham. In 1890, Howell, in a sermon of the Church of St Margaret's, Westminster, at a fundraising occasion to the building of a Welsh church in West London, had drawn attention to the fact that the church had become distant from the people of Wales. Now, it appears that A.G. Edwards was present, but that he'd asked David Howell to preach instead of him, because he himself was to preach at St Paul's Cathedral that evening. Now, the message of the sermon was that the church in Wales had failed to adapt to the particular circumstances of Wales. Now, this could be interpreted to mean that Hywel was accusing the church of ignoring what was characteristic of Wales, its culture and language, and had therefore, adopted policies which brought in English clerics, and had therefore undermined the Welsh language. One result of this policy of Anglicisation of the Church of England in Wales was that the Welsh language had become associated with non-conformity and with Welsh political movements. Hywel could see Welsh clerics moving towards support for disestablishment in order to quell any attempts at Anglicisation. Recognizing, therefore, that there was at the same time an attempt to disestablish and to overturn the church for political as well as spiritual reasons, and Hywel didn't support the idea of disestablishing the church. He was confident in the church's strength because this had been a period of regeneration in its life and mission. He was confident then in its vocation and mission. This would carry her through, disestablishment or not. And the sermon appeared in a pamphlet supporting disestablishment. Now, Bishop Edwards wasn't happy, and he accused Hywel of having a dual attitude towards disestablishment, noting that he failed to understand how someone who was a canon of one of Wales's cathedrals, and therefore dependent on its funding, could in any way support the idea of disestablishment and disendowment. More than this, Edward threatened Hywel, saying that he'd consider withdrawing the post of Archdeacon of Wrexham, which he was meant to be given to Hywel. But he said he couldn't do so, since his predecessor had made the arrangements and the process had too far advanced. And Hywel emphasized that he supported neither disestablishment nor disendowment, although he had at the same time sent a pamphlet given to him to an MP and vicar of Harden, who happened to be the son of W.E. Gladstone. And this was Bishop Edwards' excuse for giving David Hywel a dressing down. And the correspondence was published in 1893, and it explains why, amongst other later issues, why Edwards was so antagonistic towards Hywel, and why he wasn't happy for him to become Dean of St David's in 1897. And certainly, Edwards was instrumental in ensuring that John Owen became Bishop of St David's in 1897, and not Hywel. Now, there's a perfect irony to this discussion, a personal irony in respect of Edwards, because what Hywel emphasized in his sermon, it echoes clearly the words of the public statements of one of A.G. Edwards' brothers, namely his older brother, Henry Thomas Edwards, 1834 to 1870. And he was Dean of Bangor in 1876 until his untimely death in 1884. And the irony was reinforced when we read the footnotes in the published version of the sermon. They're full of extensive quotes from the words of Henry Thomas Edwards. Now, unlike his brother Alfred, Henry Edwards, who was not either supportive of the idea of disestablishing the church, he wanted to change the institution's policy of appointing those people who weren't Welsh and who had no interest in or sympathy for things Welsh, particularly the language and culture. He therefore wrote an open letter to Gladstone in 1870, requesting a change in the policy which had deprived the church in Wales of bishops who were Welsh and could speak Welsh for centuries. and the outcome seems to have been the nomination of Joshua Hughes as Bishop of St Asaph, and therefore A.G. Edwards' predecessor, and the first native Welsh bishop for centuries. And his policy after becoming bishop was to appoint Welsh-speaking clerics to livings in St Asaph. In addition, it may be argued that Edwards, H.D. Edwards, that is, had he lived, would have been the second Welshman to be a bishop in Wales. There is another irony. During Joshua Hughes's period as Vicar of Llandovery, 1846 to 1870, A.G. Evans, his curate there, was A.G. Edwards from 1874 on. Now, the dispute between Edwards and Howell wasn't the only dispute between Edwards and a cleric. Clerics, indeed, in the St Asaph diocese in 1896 and 7. The rural dean of Welshpool, who was at the same time examining chaplain to Bishop Edwards, resigned in protest against what was called the St Asaph policy. A number of clerics from the diocese met in Chester to try to seek a means of expressing to their bishop their unhappiness with the way Edwards was acting, the patronage which he could use as Bishop of St Asaph. According to a petition sent to him, he had overlooked a number of older, experienced priests in the diocese when appointing incumbents to livings, and he named 8 of them. And secondly, he'd appointed priests who could not speak Welsh to senior posts. Now, the bishop, three days before he received the petition, signed by 75 priests, including D.R. Thomas, Archdeacon of Montgomery, and the diocesan historian, had sent a letter to his cleric requesting a meeting in Wrexham to discuss the matter of this patronage. The bishop returned the petition, asking for it to be considered at the Wrexham meeting. The petitioners refused because the bishop hadn't answered them. They didn't wish to place the matter before a meeting, which would in effect be a tribunal chaired by the bishop, where curates would be present. And the petitioners hadn't asked them to sign the petition because their future was dependent on the favour and patronage of the bishop. And thirdly, it would be impossible, because of the current disturbed state of the diocese, to ensure a fair discussion. Now, after the bishop answered the petitioners requested a meeting between him and themselves alone. No, said the bishop. He wanted all clerics in the diocese to attend the meeting, and so it happened. The bishop explained that he'd regarded patronage as a sacred trust and appointed 26 persons to a seat at the cathedral. One of these appointments, of course, was John Owen, as Dean of St Asaph in 1889, immediately after Edwards had been made a bishop. Another was Llewellyn Wyn Jones, appointed Archdeacon of Wrexham by Edwards to succeed David Howell in 1897. And here is another telling point. Jones couldn't speak Welsh. And as the bishop was reminded by the vicar of Gwyddelwen, who'd been in orders for 27 years. In his reply, Edwards replied that, on average, all of them he'd appointed had been in holy orders for over 32 years. Well, but it must be borne in mind that John Owen was only ordained in 1879. And he'd appointed clerics on average after 18.5 years in order to 67 livings. Of these, 7 could not speak Welsh, and he appointed 12 Welsh-speaking clerics to parishes where Welsh wasn't essential. According to Edwards, he'd never neglected the duty of making appropriate religious provision for Welsh-speaking parishioners. But he had also to be fair to the English. And when selecting archdeacons, He had to be free to choose the best for the post. Ultimately, a compromise was reached between bishops and clerics, and indeed some of them received preferments, and it doesn't appear that Edwards took any revenge on those who drew up the petition. Now, in addition, this emphasis on statistics and numbers is characteristic of Edwards' methods of working. For instance, he'd planned a handbook on a defense of the church in 1894, quoting earlier material which he'd collected, which is full of statistics taken from official nonconformist handbooks as well as Anglicans, where Edwards challenged any notion that the church was in decline. He emphasized the numbers and the difference in the way the free churches counted their members and how the church did so, and the difference between the gathered congregations of churches and a church which served the whole community in which it was located at a parochial and national level. Now, later on, he was involved in an education campaign. The new county councils refused to accept that voluntary schools should be maintained through the rates. On the other hand, Edwards was unhappy that denominational religious education wasn't provided in county schools. Edwards' attempt in the House of Lords was ultimately unsuccessful. He couldn't solve the problem, but there was one outcome which would prove useful in future: a closer liaison between Edwards and David Lloyd George. When the Liberal government came to power in 1906, the question of disestablishment and disendowing the church in Wales returned to the agenda. And although the government sought to delay dealing with the issue, since other matters, such as doing away with the House of Lords veto, were pressing, because without this, it couldn't be delivered. An expression of this delay was the establishment of a royal commission on the Welsh Church in 1907. But the disestablishment campaign went on. Edwards, from the very beginning, was among the leaders of the movement to defend the church from attacks. Indeed, he and Bishop John Owen, who'd long been associated with him, were the two most prominent figures in the campaign in the view of the public. They were leaders. Edward had the link to government. Owen had the financial statistics. Owen said that Edwards had the gift of going straight to the heart of any issue because of his perceptive ability, while he, Owen, was more cautious and practical in his approach to problems. It was certainly Edwards who decided to launch the campaign to defend the church, not only in Wales, remember, but against what he described as an attempt to pillage the church. He opposed Gladstone when he accused the church of being a church for the rich, concentrating on the fact that the church, through the system of parishes, was closer to and ministered to the poor in a way that the free churches didn't, because they didn't have a presence, for instance, throughout the whole Diocese of St. Asaph, for instance. One of Edwards' strengths was his experience of parliamentary organisations and his links with politicians and members of Parliament. But as we know, in the end, his experience and his labours ended in failure, and the Welsh Church Act was passed on the 18th of September 1914. The third element of the campaign to disestablish the church, a point emphasised already by Edwards and Owen, that the fact that the church, that is, 4 dioceses, would be separated from the province of Canterbury. It wasn't Parliament's business to do so, in their opinion, without at least consulting with the church people. And this relationship was the business of the church, extending over centuries, which has seen the church in Wales being part of the province of Canterbury. Now, this is where the confusion and ambiguity arise. On the one hand, the campaign led by Edward to keep the Church of England in Wales within the establishment and therefore under the authority of Parliament. But there's an objection to that parliament to deal in this way with an established church. At the same time, Edwards had emphasized that the church in Wales had a long history, longer indeed than the Church of England, and that her status shouldn't be disturbed. Edwards didn't stress that the church, for a considerable proportion of that time, had been totally independent of England and the province of Canterbury. That, of course, would have undermined his argument. And indeed, following disestablishment, many stressed the same history to justify the independence and identity of the church in Wales. When Edwards and his fellow bishops came together in September 1914, his spirit began to rise, and in the discussions between them, with the exception of Bishop Babanga, who still hoped for a revocation of the Act before at the end of the war, A.G. Edwards came round to the idea that some form of disestablishment should be accepted, and to prepare the church for existence as a disestablished church. It was this which led to calling the Convention of the Church in Wales in October 1917, and preparations made by creating a representative body and a governing body, as well as battling to improve the terms of disendowment. The matter of dismemberment was dealt with by the action of Randall Davidson, Archbishop of Canterbury, when he released the 4 bishops from their oath to him, and he did that on the 31st of March 1920. They were therefore free, the 4 bishops, to create a new ecclesiastical province for Wales. And Edwards was elected Archbishop of Wales on Wednesday, April the 7th, 1920, and he was enthroned at St. Asaph Cathedral on the 1st of June 1920, with Randall Davidson present. So, this ambitious, complex character attained the pinnacle of a disestablished church, the Church in Wales, although he'd battled so earnestly to prevent this from happening. And this was a church which retained remains of its past as part of the Church of England. After all, its title was the Anglican Church in Wales, not the Church of Wales. He was to minister in a nation whose culture, or the importance of his language, didn't fully acknowledge, unlike his brother. So, despite his stubbornness, his magisterial attitude towards his clerics, his tendency to favor and extend patronage to those who supported his policies, and his hatred towards those who opposed him, and his sharp tongue, from which John Owen and Frank Morgan had suffered, his clear, determined and uncompromising policies, and his parliamentary experience and his presence in the corridors of power, and his closest to those with power and influence, and his influence, personal associations mostly, and it's no surprise that no papers have survived to record his activities. Alfred George Edwards played a basic and key part in the process which led to the disestablishment, disendowment, and dismemberment of the Church in Wales in 1920. Thank you. Thank you, Bishop Wyn, for that extremely interesting discussion. We do appreciate your learning and your excellent research. A proper historian. We're very grateful to you. Thank you. We're slightly behind, but to be fair to Bishop Wyn, he had suggested that he might overrun. So he's made up some time. May I suggest that we have a 5-minute break to have an opportunity to have something to eat, drink perhaps, and then welcome you back at 10 to 8 in order to hear from the Reverend Geoffrey Gaynor. So thank you very much. See you soon in about 7 minutes. Thank you. Welcome back. I hope you've had a chance to refresh your cup of tea. Thank you once again, Bishop Wyn, for his contribution. An extremely interesting talk. And as I mentioned earlier, in a little over half an hour, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions and to have a further chat, a more informal chat. But before that, very great welcome to the Reverend Geoffrey Gaynor. Geoffrey, as many people in Wales, has a connection with the Rhondda. His family comes from Blaenllechen in the Rhondda Bach, and the family has lived there for about 5 generations, but unfortunately they moved to England, so that's why he attended Catholic school in Coventry before going on to Jesus College, Oxford, as we mentioned earlier, in order to study divinity. He was ordained and began his ministry in industrial parishes in Llandaff diocese, and then, and this is when our paths first crossed, he came for 5 years, a New Testament Greek at the St. Michael's College, and my father at the time was a priest at St. David's in Canon. It was always a pleasure to invite Geoffrey. One of the things perhaps we don't see, will not be seen tonight, but I remember very lively, it was his musical ability. He is a master on the piano and he has a wonderful singing voice. And one of the things I remember from my early 20s when I was at the university was hearing Geoffrey serenading my grandmother when she was with us, something she also mentioned. So, after St. Michael's College, for 30 years, he was the rector of near Carmarthen, and he has now moved to North Ceredigion, where he's still interested in languages, and particularly the Celtic languages. But tonight, the Reverend Geoffrey Gaynor is going to talk about Bishop John Owen. So, without further ado, welcome the Reverend Geoffrey Gaynor. We look very much forward to hearing what you have to say about Bishop John Owen. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well then, a few days before Christmas, 1869, the then Vicar of Caernarfon, the Reverend Henry Thomas Edwards, who was a Vicar of Caernarfon, wrote a lengthy letter, an essay, perhaps almost a thesis, to William Ewart Gladstone, the Prime Minister. The Parliament had just agreed on the disestablishment of the Irish Church after an election where the issue was central to the campaigns. And H.G. Edwards foresaw the possibility that the same thing would happen here in Wales. He was worried about the state of the established church because it became apparent that the vast majority of the people, the worshipping population, had turned to the chapels. Radicals accused the church of being negligent in their regard to the Welsh language, and would break the link between the state and the church. They also mentioned the injustices that the majority of Welsh had to face, such as paying to maintain a church where they didn't worship, and being unable to graduate from the ancient universities and so on. Edwards answered that by saying that it was through government policies at the beginning of the 18th century that these injustices arose. The injustice on the Welsh Church by not appointing Welsh speakers to be bishops since the 1714 and 1869, by sending bishops who neither spoke Welsh and who were remote from the flocks they served. By going, this mentioned, went across, contrary to Article 24 of the 39 Articles, which was plainly repugnant to the word of God to have public prayer or to minister the sacrament in a tongue not understood of the people. What was the result of this initiative? In 1870, Watkin Williams, Member of Parliament, put forward a motion in the House of Commons to break the link between the Church in Wales and the state. Gladstone argued against this and won the vote. In the same year, however, Joshua Hughes was appointed Bishop of St Asaph, the first Welshman to hold such a post in Wales since John Wyn of in 1700 to be moved to be the Bishop of Bath and Wells. By the end of the 19th century, all the Welsh four diocesan bishops were Welsh speakers, amongst them John Owen, Bishop of St Davids, and he was established in St Davids and continued in post until his death in 1926. There was no doubt about the Welshness of this man. He'd been a Welsh teacher in Lampeter, and after that he moved to Llandovery and served as head of the college, of the school there. But what were the most important influences on his character? Firstly, his home in Llyn. His father was a weaver and became a wool merchant in time, but a fairly poor background. He came to the world. His mother was from Aberdaron, and to the end of her life, hardly spoke any English. She had a smattering, but she didn't discuss anything in English. When he was only 10 years old, John had to help as an interpreter, who's also a Welsh speaker, as an interpreter. When he was being questioned by the headmaster of a Botwnog school, John had to act as an interpreter for his father, so that they understood each other. John Owen was a Welshman in language, appearance, and culture. Secondly, there was the factor of his religion. His father was a deacon in the Capel y Bwlch near Llanengan with the Calvinistic Methodists. He was born in a Calvinistic home. According to J.T. Davies, Owen's son-in-law later, the atmosphere in the cottage, Ysgubor Wen, was full of speaking about theological matters. Reading the Bible was usual, and making prayers, and was central to the boys' early experiences. John kept his emphasis on prayer and the scriptures until the end. But in his teens, he started to doubt the principles of Calvinism. Thirdly, the influence of the school. Chiefly Ysgol Botwnog, and David Jenkins, the head teacher, an Anglican originally from Cornwall. Jenkins used the collect in the Book of Common Prayer every week. He didn't try to force John to worship in the parish church, and John appreciated, and his father Griffith appreciated this liberal attitude. When he was only 15, he was offered post as a teacher, pupil teacher, so that he could earn £20 a year, and an opportunity also to learn classics and mathematics, and to hoping to go on to one of the ancient universities. His main subjects were mathematics and Greek and Latin, and he succeeded in his attempts to enter Jesus College, Oxford. He became a fervent reader, and even in this early period, he started to read H.E. Edwards's articles in favor of the established church. And fourthly, we should mention the influence of the local priests. In a series of articles in the Canon Church News from April 111, Owen paid tribute to Canon James Owen about the Reverend J.C. Williams Ellis, the fellow of City Sussex, Cambridge. He said at the time, were it not for his kindness, I would not have won a scholarship to Oxford. And this is important because John Owen, all through his life, respected the post of a parish priest. Although he never himself held that post, he respected the post and tried to help his fellow priests in all the parishes throughout his time as bishop. He did his best to raise money from the lay people, to help clerics to have a living. He is associated, not so much his background, although some have appreciated the fact that he was a man of the people, but rather for his function in the campaign, different campaigns, which stirred the waters in the second half of the 19th century. He came to public recognition a time in Lampeter, where he stayed for 6 years from 1879 onwards, and in the same year was made deacon by Bishop Basil Jones and priested the following year. Education was an important subject for him throughout his life, and a subject that was quite controversial in Wales because of the tension between church and chapel, which tended to create dissension. The background of this business was, of course, the fact that the church, particularly in the north of Wales and in the Bangor diocese, tried to establish church schools. Dean Cotton, for instance, in Bangor was prominent in that movement. And at the same time, thousands, not hundreds, thousands of churches were built across the land. On average, in this period, the first part of that century, one chapel a week. Of course, things have changed. Now we have one closing every week. So it was an odd situation. The national schools, church schools, where the catechism was taught, the church catechism was taught, was increasing in their numbers. But the children from non-conformist backgrounds attended them at times. This caused difficulties in the Liberal parties, which saw this as an unfairness, as did several other aspects of the public life of the church. How did John respond? Ultimately, he believed that parents had the right to insist on religious education for their children, which is consistent with their own religious beliefs, particularly when parents had to send their children to school. The background to this was his firm belief that it was through divine ordination that the family, a nation, and a church exist, not because of the will of man, but because of the will of God. John Owen could be controversial. He was more willing to agree with Peter than the previous subject, although a paper in Lerpwl at the time of his appointment to cooperate with A.J. Edwards in the cathedral said that he was combative. Once again, it wasn't in order to argue that John Owen won attention. Indeed, Owen welcomed the Welsh Intermediate Education Act. Well, Edwards, on the other hand, saw it and condemned the fact that it's saturated with non-denominationalism. The Bishop of St. Asaph was clear on his opinion and condemned the act. John Owen, on the other hand, showed a practical interest in schools during his career. He supported the grammar school of Ystrad Meurig in his diocese. A bishop who very liked the school where he was educated. That is, Ysgol Botwnog, very similar, both grammar schools. At the same time, because he supported the denominational school, he faced strong criticism. Lampeter College at St. David's refused to accept it as part of the University of Wales, since some considered that it was a theological college rather than a university. John Owen firmly refused this. During the time in St. Asaph, John Owen took an important part in the argument about the tithes. And when the agricultural industry was in severe depression because of the imports of wheat from Canada and so on, and it's had a great effect on the income of farmers, and they disagreed with the old practice of paying the tithes to a foreign church. And in his paper, the radical Thomas G. was against what he called the old witch, or the old hag, rather than the old mother. John Owen faced up to the challenge, and in the pages of the same publication between August and September, he wrote a series of letters and articles which contradicted G's arguments. John Owen was concerned about the effect of this dispute on the relationship of the parish priest, losing income, of course, and his parishioners. And this was not characteristic of him, because he wanted to create unity and goodwill between people, not in order to win an argument. He started his campaigns, but in order to show justice, in his opinion, the justice of his standpoint. He was therefore anxious to change the religious climate and the political climate after the Calvinistic Methodists, once the most powerful in the north, had turned against the old mother for a number of reasons. And the Liberal Party, as we heard in this period, had decided to support the campaign for disestablishment and disendowment of the church. Well, this argument about the tithes came to an end when the responsibility was turned over to the landowners. a very sensible move. But the problem concerning the relationship with the state had not finished, unfortunately, and arguments and the bitterness continued for decades, and which had a bad effect on the Christian testimony generally. Why did Owen argue against disestablishment of the church so long and for so bitterly? We shall see his arguments in his speeches and his contributions to the press. Firstly, he believed that such an act would be certain to weaken the church, the oldest establishment in the church and a Christian establishment. The effect on religion generally, through taking over assets and so on, and damaging the parish ministry. Secondly, he believed that it would tear the unity between the Welsh diocese and the province of Canterbury. Not through the law of the land the unity came about, in his opinion, but through an awareness of a common faith between Wales and England. After all, the convocation had been the authority within the province of Canterbury for centuries before the House of Commons was established. Thirdly, he emphasized that he was anxious to recognize the principle of the Welshness of the church in the face of accusations by some nonconformists that it was a means of anglicizing the country. And he was a good example of a Welshman who was a churchman. He strongly believed in the principle of an established state church, giving priority to one denomination, not to dominate the others, but to provide a ministry for the whole community and to the whole country. And in that, he gave the figures and statistics showing that the vicar was available in several communities where there was no nonconformist minister. Lastly, he saw enough evidence to challenge the argument that Wales was a nonconformist nation. And many agreed with, from the other side, agreed with this. And as the way the chapels went into debt in erecting chapels, and again losing some support. And to that, of course, he was quite right in saying that he would act in accordance with the principles of the radicals, would be damaging to the country and would lead to the secularization of this country. And he pointed his finger to what was happening in the cities of England and how more and more were turning back their backs on public worship altogether. Of course, the question inevitably arises, was Owen unsuccessful? After all, as we heard earlier, the Act was passed. In 1914, Lloyd George, and by the way, although A.G. Edwards was friendly with Lloyd George, Owen wasn't, and certainly not. Lloyd George and McKenna were robust as Home Secretary, and Asquith succeeded in pushing through the bill through Parliament, pressing the legislation to get rid of the veto of the House of Lords. And the Act was accepted. But we must realize, although he'd lost the parliamentary battle, and John Owen was seen on that crucial evening, downcast, walking sadly through the corridors of Westminster. Again, the House of Lords did vote for this, but Owen was pragmatic enough to face the next challenge, to conform to the Act for the benefit of the Church, and broke free from the province of Canterbury. After all, although he'd turned his back on some aspect of his Calvinistic upbringing, he hadn't turned his back on the principle of salvation. He would not give in to despair, even at the darkest hour. He tried to meet others to ensure the continuation. And we must remember that he'd warned that the Diocese of St. David's and the Church would lose most of its income and would be more dependent, of course, on voluntary donations. And this was a cause for concern for many, as he warned. For instance, 2 years before the bill was passed, he spoke in 8 diocesan conferences in England. He was a busy man. There was that concern, but rather than being paralyzed by despair, he worked pragmatically to ensure the stability and worked in accordance with the clauses of the Act, and showed another aspect of his personality, his willingness and his ability to attract other people to cooperate happily with him. For instance, in January 1915, he met the Joint Committee in London, and immediately after that, John Owen went to see John Sankey, the churchman and lawyer, asked him to prepare the necessary plans to establish a representative body and a governing body. It must be noted that John Owen's chaplain, Ben Davies, had already sent to the Archbishop of Canterbury a number of copies of the Constitution, other Anglican constitutions from across the world, and therefore Sankey started this work the very next day. And that's another strength of John Owen, his ability to attract other people to work, ever since he was a fairly young man. For in Llandovery, he influenced Frank Morgan, who helped him on historical subjects. Frank Morgan was a fellow of Keble College in Oxford. This was one of the advantages of having somebody like John Owen in a prominent place. According to Harry Williams, who's written a thesis which certainly deserves attention, John Owen led the campaign again. John himself called A.G. Edwards the chief, and he didn't want to be Archbishop of Wales, and very suitably, appropriately therefore, John Owen went to another direction, writing a theology, a thesis a week before the convocation in Cardiff in 1917, when the schemes were accepted to establish a structure for the Church in Wales. In his contribution, he emphasized the need to ensure the continuation of the Church, not only in the near future, but for years to come. Because in his opinion, the Church was central to the identity of Wales. After all the arguments, John Owen sought to reconcile people, different Christians of different traditions, emphasizing the common ground, and approved, for instance, the statements of the Lambeth Conference concerning Christian unity in 1920. In fact, J.O. was liberally minded, under the influence of one of his heroes, F.D. Morris, and John Owen read much of his work almost every year when he would go on holiday to Switzerland. And he wanted to reconcile Christians together and be willing to give an address to the annual meeting of the evangelical churches a few years after disestablishment. So he was a man who understood the mindset of the nonconformists better, perhaps, than some of the Anglo-Catholics in the southeast of Wales, in Llandaff, who objected to his scheme for a concordat about religious education in schools, based on scripture and the Apostles' Creed. In conclusion, I would like to mention his theology. It's easy for us to ignore this in concentrating on his public life and the arguments against disestablishment and so on. And then his helping with the formation of the constitution of the disestablished church. The role he saw was to teach the faith, and John saw a link between pastoral work and preaching, and this is true. The principle of Lampeter praised John Owen's sermon, suggesting that he had understood the spiritual needs of young men who were preparing for the sacred ministry. And this is true of his attitudes throughout his life. Secondly, John had been influenced when he was a young lad in Botwnog by attending the church services in Mellteirn and appreciated the language and depth of the Book of Common Prayer. For him, the collects were extremely useful material for meditation, as he would commend them. He was a prayerful man who could link his spiritual experience and the experience of his fellow Welshmen. He died in London in 1926, and when he died, he was widely mourned, and I have read some of the tributes to him. They all agreed that he was a great Welshman and a good pastor. Indeed, his funeral in Abergwili was characteristic of him. It was simple and sincere, and he was greatly mourned. Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Geoffrey. An extremely interesting discussion on John Owen. And it's very interesting to note that he, as A.G. Edwards, will have been mentioned as the first of the Welsh bishops, but that he'd refused even to consider being Archbishop. In the he presided over the election of A.G. Edwards as the first Archbishop of Wales. We have about 5 minutes for questions, so thank you, Bishop Wyn and the Reverend Geoffrey Gaynor, for their extremely interesting contributions.